2003. We publicly launched the Camano Wildlife Habitat Project in February 2003. So we've had 20 full years of programming and we're continuing on. And thank you if you're a part of our project. And if you don't, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our Camano Wildlife Habitat Project, where we're creating an island in harmony with nature, 1 yard at a time. So we're doing this because it's easy to sob about all the loss of habitat, and we can't do anything about the laws and the ordinances and the the regulations that allow development and loss of the forests, but we can do things in our yard. And by doing things in our yards, we're able to reconnect corridors and use, backyards can connect and connect to the parks and reestablish some wildlife corridors for the critters. So it's a simple process and you don't have to do everything at once. So here's my yard. I moved here in November of 1994 and there was a front yard of grass and the slope didn't have, the trees weren't very big right then. So it was just kind of a sterile landscape except for a cedar tree. And then through the years we added and added and added. So now we have a lush wildlife habitat. We started out on the left side of the yard. Actually, we started out with planters in the front part of the picture on the bottom there. And then we just continued on with taking out the grass. So now it's a lush spot. It's quite lovely in the hot summer when the neighbors are sitting there with dry front lawns and I go up. I live down the hill at the beach, and I go up and it's just cool and refreshing. And notice that I have layers in the yard. So there's layers for the different critters. So that when you're landscaping for wildlife, it's thinking about ground cover, shrubs, um, trees, and that helps wherever the critters find their best spot for um, living and finding and foraging. So the four basic needs for wildlife are food, water, shelter, and places to raise young. So in a certified wildlife habitat is providing those four things. And with the water, sometimes people don't have easy access to water, and it can be as simple as the bottom of a pot. You just need to add some rocks so that the sides aren't steep, and then you have a little simple way to have water for the wildlife. And the other thing is to think about responsible gardening and sustainable gardening. So reducing lawn, that also is very helpful for living on an island because with our single source aquifer, um, watering the grass isn't a good use of our water. Growing natives is real useful for um, not having the growth in the yard without having to worry about watering them. And also it is providing things that the wildlife can eat and be beneficial for them. You don't have to be a purist. You can certify your yard at any point. And as you certify, some of the salmonscaping types of things that are listed here are you start to do more. So like when I started the project, I had elder kitties that kind of just would go outside and lie in a sunbeam. And then when I got to kitties who they've never been outside except for a little escape, and then they decide they don't know what to do and they come right back in easily. So so I evolved from letting my cats out to not. So being a wildlife habitat makes you think about what you're doing in the yard that's going to be beneficial. And it also helps on a community aspect because if you think about if a lot of people are doing this, then you can actually use your backyards to kind of reestablish corridors. Like Russell Link, who is a biologist with Fish and Wildlife who lives on Whidbey, he wrote a book called Landscaping for Wildlife and also Living with Wildlife. And it's about the Pacific Northwest, so it's real helpful. He talks about areas. So area 1 would be close to the house. Area 2 would be like the places where you walk around and go through. And areas 3 is like the back of the yard where you don't necessarily go a lot. And it's where you could have a brush pile or you could, have things a little more wild there. And if those backyards link up, they actually can, with other people's yards, even small lots can be wildlife habitat and can continue on with the corridor. So it's really simple to be a certified wildlife habitat. You can find this application on our website. If you're from Camano, this is there, and you can send it in to me and I can count. We're up to 1,042 wildlife habitats on Camano now, working for 1,100. And you can also go directly to the National Wildlife Federation, which certifies wildlife habitats, and apply online. And if you want, you can put up a sign. If you do, then I get calls and say, "Oh, I can do that." And then the 1 yard at a time idea is coming along because it's promoting the project and letting people be aware. It also helps if you're thinking that sometimes people think that wildlife habitats are messy, and they're a little messier. They don't have to be. It's kind of perspective. And with that, a wildlife habitat sign and some yard art gives your garden perspective of this is why it's happening. It's purposeful. So on Camano, we have, I mentioned, 1,042 certified wildlife habitats. Easy to do. You fill out the application. It's a simple checklist, and then you're part of a kind of a trend that's going around, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. There's 18 community wildlife habitats on the island. Camano was the second in the state, and there are 148 certified community habitats in the nation, and Camino was the second. Tukwila was the fourth in the nation to be certified. So they have really made the Pacific Northwest almost a regional wildlife habitat with the National Wildlife Certification Program. So you can get more information from the National Wildlife Federation website as well as from our website. Roxy has done a fabulous job with our website. You can go and look at our old programs. You can go and find our plant lists and a variety of things. So it's really quite useful, and it looks beautiful. Then these are some references. They're very helpful. I mentioned the Living with Wildlife and Landscaping for Wildlife. It's by Russell Link. He's local, so the information in those two books are Pacific Northwest specifically. The Attracting Birds and Butterflies and Other Backyard Wildlife Habitat is a book by the National Wildlife Federation. It's the updated edition, and that's very useful as well. And here's our sign. We have the Community Wildlife Habitat. So thank you if you're a part of our program. And if you're not, find out more. I will be at the 55 Plus Resource Fair. That's going to be at the Camano Center on March 4th. So I have handouts like with native plants and various things that help people enhance their yards with wildlife habitat. And we also are doing some programs. And before I introduce our speaker, I will have, sorry, Lisa, I had a mental block to say Lisa. I will tell you about our programs coming up. So in March, Shona Aitken is going to come and talk about owls, and she offered to do a special tour of their facility, and this is not something that they generally do. So we have a small amount of people that we can do this tour with. So if you're interested, you can do a screenshot of this information and let us know. And or Roxy's going to put the information in the chat as well. But it's going to be, our program is March 15th about owls, and Shona's going to do that. And then she's going to take us around for about a 90-minute tour, hour to 90 minutes of the facilities. We won't be able to see wildlife that's being treated. It's kind of the things that are empty, but get a little idea, because wildlife rehabilitators want to keep as much human contact away from their patients. But that's coming up. And with that, let me undo my screen and introduce, stop share, here we go. And then let me introduce Lisa. And so Lisa is the Director of Programs for the Northwest Straits Foundation, and they are working to help make the shorelines more friendly for both the nearshore habitat and the critters that like the smell that are spawning and the various things that are going on, as well as what's going on the slopes, so that it's not bulkheads that are eliminating access and various things that she will talk about. But she's been working on that. She manages, I'm reading my notes here a little bit so I get it better than my blah. Anyway, so she manages nearshore habitat restoration and project development with the implementation, the supervision, and she works with partners so that the Northwest Straits Foundation works with others so that, you know, collaborates, and that makes a better project through that. And she also leads the shoreline friendly landowner outreach workshops. And there's one that's happening at Smoky Point, but I heard that that's full, the one that's coming up, like next, not in
25th.
Yeah, so coming. So, but I'm sure that you will do more of those. So with that, Lisa is going to tell us about how we can protect the shorelines and work with the Northwest Straits Foundation and think of it as a community approach. So welcome, Lisa.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Val and Roxy for inviting me. As you were giving your introduction, I just kind of kept thinking about the commonalities, things that you mentioned that really resonate with the work that we do as well. Connectivity in particular is really what we're aiming for. We want to make sure that we're connecting the marine habitats to the near shore, to the back shore, to the uplands, and into the forest. So that really was just, it kind of just hit on a, exactly with what we work on. And you mentioned kind of, that wild lands can be messy, and we always refer to messy shorelines are healthy shorelines. The more wood that's on a, obviously not pollution wise, but the more wood that's on a beach, the more that you see beach rack and eelgrass, washed up on the beaches and vegetation. If it takes the effort to walk on a Puget Sound beach, then it's probably a healthier beach than our beaches that don't have any of that, if they're bulkheaded or hardened. So yeah, a lot of resonation with what you said. So I really appreciated that. So let me share my screen, and then I will kind of dive into it, and I'll provide a bit of an introduction to who we are as an organization, and what we do, and then I'll provide some information about some of the other programs that we work on, and then I'll get into more of the nearshore elements that I actually work on for restoration and our shore friendly program. So I really, again, I appreciate you allowing me to present, and I hope you guys, find some value in what I have to talk about tonight. All right, so yeah, here we go. Or off the bat, there we go. So before I get too far into my presentation, we do want to acknowledge that the lands that we're on today are the ancestral and current homelands of Indigenous nations who have stewarded them since time immemorial. The Northwest Straits Foundation and the initiative spans 7 counties. So, we certainly, try and work hard to support the sovereignty and the rights of those tribes that are across our region. I won't necessarily list all of them off, but they're listed all here. And we like to, when we can, we enjoy the partnerships and relationships that we can build with those tribes, working together in concert to help restore, their homelands as well. So again, the Northwest Straits Foundation and the initiative covers the 7 northern counties of the Sound. So mostly, all of our the less populated areas of Puget Sound and our section of the Salish Sea. So we go all the way out to Clallam County, Jefferson, and down to Snohomish, and up all the way up to Whatcom County, where I live. Pretty good geography to work in. So we're the Northwest Straits Foundation is kind of one leg of this 3-legged stool that was created as a bottom-up approach to what was originally going to be a proposed national marine sanctuary in the San Juans. And instead, Congress authorized this structure where we have kind of this bottom-up effort working with marine resources committees, in which Island County has one that is very active and does a lot of great work. So throughout this region, and then there's the Northwest Straits Commission is kind of a government body that provides funding and support to the MRCs. And then I work for the foundation, and we're the nonprofit arm of the whole 3-legged stool. And we work in concert together. We also have our own separate programs. So there's a lot of cross-pollination as well as some individual efforts that go on throughout each of the organizations. And the foundation itself was established in 2002, originally as a nonprofit to leverage funding really to support the work of the Marine Resources Committees. But now, again, we have a really wide array of our own programs. But the goals across the initiative really have a lot of common themes and common messages. And so we're always still working to restore the health, restore and protect the health of the Northwest Straits marine resources by promoting and implementing science-based restoration and stewardship. We developed a lot of strategic partnerships in order to accomplish our work. We apply for funding through corporations and other foundations, individual donations. We partner, like I said, with the Marine Resources Committees to accomplish the projects and to have them in some ways guide some of the work and provide, the big ideas about maybe what they want to see in their local communities. We work closely with the commission, and we can't do our work without the vast array of public and private landowners throughout the region as well. We have, for the foundation, we have about 5 core programs and then a handful of kind of smaller programs as well. Again, my program that I run are the nearshore restoration program and the shore-friendly landowner outreach program. And then my coworkers work on derelict gear removal, citizen science monitoring, which actually relates back to the nearshore restoration program. And then we also just recently started a Salish Sea Conservation Corps, which is kind of an internship program for college students in our area. And I'll kind of dive into each of those different programs. And again, I'll start with sort of the ones that I don't work on necessarily directly so that I can provide a little more focus on the work that I do at the end. So the derelict fishing gear removal program, I assume that some good portion of the people around here are familiar at some level with removals of fishing nets that have been going on for now 20 years throughout the Sound. And we've been leading that program for that entire time. So the goal initially was to remove abandoned fishing nets that would traditionally be lost over time, and they continue to fish while they're under the water and not being used. And to date, we've removed close to 5,800 nets have been removed around the Sound, and over almost 7,000 crab pots have been removed. Our focus now, all the nets, most of the nets that had been removed were kind of referred to as legacy nets. They'd been there from the heyday of salmon fisheries, in the 70s, 80s, and a little bit in the 90s. With obviously reduction in salmon fishing now has an effect of not having a lot of nets there to be removed. And so a lot of our focus now is actually on kind of an instantaneous response for net removal when there's a reporting of a net. We have partnerships and contracts with organizations that can help remove those nets pretty quickly when they're reported, rather than having to do a mass effort of removing thousands of nets across the entire Sound. And a lot of our focus now is moving into removing of crab pots, which unfortunately, because we have this ongoing increase in the number of boaters and crabbers, that's kind of a problem that I guess it's kind of a gift that keeps on giving in a sense. There's about 11,000 crab pots on average that are lost about every year. And so people are continuing to fish and continuing to crab. So that problem, unfortunately, is not going away. So we've developed a lot of programs now where we are actually providing education and outreach to crabbers, to fishers, in order to prevent the problem as much as we can. We have a series of videos that are part of our program that's referred to as Catch More Crab, where it demonstrates, in like 1 or 2 minute little snippets, how best to actually rig your pots and how to crab effectively so that you don't lose a pot and have the impact on the habitat and on the organisms that a lost pot does have. It's kind of ironic that we're kind of encouraging people to want to catch more crabs by the lingo that we use there. But again, we feel like it's better if people are going to be crabbing that they actually, can get the crabs out and that crab pots don't continue to fish if they've been cut off of their lines. We have some other just general community engagement programs as well. We've developed a program called the Passport to Marine Adventures a year or so ago, which is basically an online app on your phone where you can go to all these different locations around the North Sound, and from our state parks to local parks or local beaches, and take pictures and kind of just experience those different places and learn a little bit about the biology and ecology of those areas. I think seasonally, in the summertime, there's prizes that you can be awarded if you go to a certain number of places. And this is sort of an interactive tool that we've developed to get people a little more engaged in our shorelines. We've also have a scholarship program for college and graduate studies in the marine sciences. And then I mentioned earlier too that we have the Salish Sea Conservation Corps program as well, where we're engaging students that are interested in moving into the marine sciences fields. And that's just getting started, where we're going to provide them with project opportunities and mentorships, and basically give them all the tools to sort of set them off on the right path towards careers in marine sciences and marine studies. So now I'll sort of get into the meat of the efforts that I am most familiar with, and the work that I lead for the foundation. And primarily it comes under a large umbrella of just being referred to as nearshore restoration. This year, or actually I guess it's fall of 2022, we reached a milestone of having restored over 1 mile of shoreline. And when we work in projects, you refer to the projects that you do, or as kind of 1 yard at a time, we're sort of working at kind of one parcel or one community beach level at a time as well. So a couple hundred feet here and there. Now I've added up to over 5,000 linear feet of shoreline that we've restored. So we were pretty kind of proud of that. And it's taken us about 10 or 12 years or so to get to that point, including the years of the pandemic. And again, I mentioned that we've partnered with local MRCs, especially in Island County. We have a really strong relationship with the Island MRC. I'm working on projects at Deception Pass State Park, as well as some of even the private properties that we've worked on over mostly on Whidbey as well. We haven't quite gotten around to having a good project opportunity yet on Camano, but we keep trying. So most of the project work that we're doing, as I mentioned, it's sort of like 100 or 200 feet or so at a time, with some projects that are longer. But we really are focusing on reducing the impacts from shoreline armoring. So bulkheads, seawalls, hardened structures that have straightened our shorelines and taken away a lot of the complexity of our shorelines. And the reason we're doing this is, there's several different reasons, but primarily this effect that's referred to now as coastal squeeze is a big concern, and it's definitely impacted with shoreline armor. So, with natural shorelines and current sea levels, we have plenty of room for surf smelt and sand lance, two species of fish that require our shorelines and our nearshore habitat to spawn. And they're capable of doing that when it's an unarmored natural shoreline even at our current levels. And even with a natural shoreline with future sea levels, if there isn't an obstructing object such as a bulkhead or even combs that are too close to the water, those habitats are going to have the ability to migrate landward with sea level rise. And so you have this translation of habitats moving landward, where the forage fish can continue to spawn on the beach. It'll become, a little bit deeper, but a little higher up on the shoreline. Eelgrass beds will continue to move landward as well in order to get the daylight that they require. But those habitats would stay intact in these naturally occurring shorelines. But even now, in our currently armored shorelines across the region, our forage fish spawning habitat is being lost anywhere above mean high or high water, and in some cases even below it if we have some legacy bulkheads that are actually built really far out into the shoreline. And so you can envision a future with increased sea level rise where that habitat is completely lost, because again, there's nowhere for that habitat to migrate landward. The fish kind of just, literally would be hitting their heads on the hardened structures. And we will also eventually lose eelgrass beds too, because they no longer have any place to move as well. So this is sort of the basis behind why we're doing this work. While we look at our projects from an ecosystem restoration perspective, a primary focus of our work is looking at forage fish spawning habitat and allowing for that increased connectivity, as I mentioned, from the uplands into the marine waters. So I'm just going to kind of show a sample of some of the projects within Island County that we've done. Again, we haven't had the opportunity to do anything on Camano yet, but just to show you some befores and afters of our general restoration efforts. Coronet Bay at Deception Pass is a big project for us. We just completed our third phase of restoration there. The first phase started in 2012, removing all of the creosote bulkheads along the length of the primary area of Coronet Bay. And as a result, you go to something that looks like this, where there really is no nearshore habitat per se. It's just kind of a mud flat, really, and then there's grass in the back, to something that looks like this. And so, a little bit of the elements you kind of see of sort of the messy beach with large woody debris on the beaches, and as well as migrating up into the grassy areas to create some complexity. And we had a second phase that was actually a little closer down towards the marina that you can see in this picture a few years after that in 2015, where it was really a big fill pad area. And there was sort of this kind of messy little pond that had been dug out at one point. And so we pulled out all that fill, regraded the shoreline, actually expanded this little pond area into a bit more of a marsh, and ended up with something like this. And so these areas now, have the ability again to kind of migrate landward with climate change, with sea level rise, and create more of natural habitats that we need along these shorelines. Coronet Bay in particular is really important because it actually acts as what's referred to as like a pocket estuary. It's an area of really high use for juvenile salmon, especially in the North Sound. And it's a protected area for them to, as they're making their transition out of the Skagit River and before they head out into the deeper water. So it's a really critical area to make sure that we've restored this. And what we have found actually is that 5 years after we did the restoration at both of these locations, that we now have forage fish actually spawning on the beaches within the restored areas. So big success. And then we just recently completed the third phase of work at Hoypas Point, which is out at the northernmost tip, basically, of the Coronet Bay day use area. And this is an area where there used to be a ferry terminal that went from Island County over to Skagit before the Deception Pass Bridge was built. And so you can see it here before, it had kind of this big jutted out sort of raised platform where the rockery went pretty far out into the intertidal. And then as of November, it looks a lot more like this. This is kind of a newer beach that was created. We pulled out all that fill, regraded the beach, created a nicer little trail system. Unfortunately, all that dune grass kind of got wiped away in the king tide in December, so we'll be replanting that this spring. But a really successful project, and lots of revegetation going on, kind of reforesting the shoreline there. Several years ago, I think it's like 2017, we had a project, our first project over on the Navy base, where we removed about 1,700 feet of shoreline armor from an area that's referred to as a feeder bluff, which is these high bluffs of which Camano is renowned for, that supply the sediments to our shorelines and support the coastal processes that build and maintain our beaches. And this area was actually, it was a test case for the Army Corps of Engineers back in the 1970s to look at all the different types of shoreline armor they could potentially throw at an area and see which would fit and which would work best. There was a storm less than 2 years after they put it all in, and 90% of it all failed. But we were able to remove the remnants of everything and ended up with a nice, shoreline. Again, the woody debris was able to reaccumulate on the beach because there's no hardened structures there anymore. And here as well, after the restoration was completed, the Navy was doing forage fish spawning sampling and detected that there is ongoing forage fish, surf smelt in particular, spawning on these beaches now. Oops. So I mentioned earlier that one of the elements of the work that we also do is volunteer monitoring at our restoration sites. So we have a whole array of volunteers that have been working at these project sites for over a decade, in some cases at Coronat Bay, doing everything from beach seining to identify what the species of fish that are using the area, in particular, are there salmon using it? And we definitely verified that every species of salmon is using Coronat Bay. And to get, just to be able to get an accounting of everything else that's using it. But our volunteer monitoring doesn't stop just at beach seining. We do forage fish surveys. We look at the accumulation of large woody debris on the beaches, beach wrack, which is, again, the eelgrass and vegetation that washes up within the high tides. Everything that we can do to sort of monitor the effects of our restoration efforts and see how our beaches are changing as a result of removing the armor. And 99% of what we do is all done with volunteers. So it's a pretty exciting time. We love our volunteers. I get a real kick out of, going to a project site and listening to the volunteers explain the benefits of the work that we've been doing and, the history of the work that we've engaged in, and they do it better than I do. So it's really rewarding, to see them engaging with parks users and other people walking on the beach and tell them everything that they ever needed to know about forage fish and why it's important. So let's grab some water here real quick. So in addition to the larger efforts that we have on, trying to identify opportunities for shoreline restoration, we're part of a region-wide program that's referred to as Shore Friendly. And when I say region-wide, it goes all the way from us up in Whatcom County, and managing our 7-county area within the Northwest Straits, all the way down now to Thurston County and Olympia. Every shoreline community has a shore-friendly program. And the goal of this program is to really reduce the impacts from shoreline armoring. So again, bulkheads, seawalls, groins, and provide opportunities on private properties to restore shoreline habitat. So we work with communities, private landowners, whomever it is, to ease their concerns about shoreline restoration and all the ins and outs that come with that with those types of projects, and help them make informed decisions regarding key features of their shoreline properties, be it vegetation, drainage, setbacks of homes from shores. If they don't have shoreline armoring, we're trying to give them all the tools necessary so that they don't ever have to put it in or consider putting it in. And if they do have shoreline armoring, we want to look at opportunities where we can for removing it where it's feasible. And in many cases, unfortunately, it's not feasible, but we still give them other tools to work with as we can. And as you're all trying to kind of rewild your, your properties throughout Camano Island, we're trying to do the same thing. So even if somebody has a bulkhead, they can still plant behind that bulkhead. They can still add more trees, more shrubs to allow for that connectivity to occur. And we hope that, as a result of our efforts, that many landowners are inspired to change how they manage their shorelines, to think of it more as them being a part of the shoreline, rather than having properties where they have a lawn and a bulkhead and they're separated really from those nearshore and shoreline habitats. And we need to do this because throughout Puget Sound, about 25% of our 2,500 miles of shoreline is now lined with some sort of bulkhead, seawall, and other armor. And over about 70% of our shorelines as well are in something other than a public ownership. So there's a lot of private property, a lot of private tidelands throughout the Sound. So we can't do this work without working with private property owners along the region. All right. And our goal is ultimately to make sure that the processes that support our beaches, so our bluffs and beaches, that they're allowed to erode naturally, that the sand and sediment, needs to build up beaches with sea level rise. But we want to obviously put that in the context of understanding the built environment and that people do live along these shorelines. So how can we provide education and tools to help people manage those processes? So the program itself offers, we have a wide variety of ways that we reach out and then we provide assistance. It was mentioned earlier, we have a workshop coming up on the 25th. And it's referred to as like a shore-friendly living workshop. In this particular workshop, we'll be talking about sea level rise and climate change, and basically any kind of adaptation strategies. But we have a lot of different types of workshops that we offer, from talking about those coastal processes, what's going on the shorelines, to getting really specific about vegetation and how to manage that vegetation. And we'll continue to do those. And we're really excited now that we're finally getting to do these in person again, rather than having to try and do them by webinars and Zoom meetings. We like the one-on-one interactions that we can have with landowners, with people that are living and using these shorelines. We have opportunities all over for community beach walks. If you want to, we like looking at the shorelines, not just from a parcel scale, but from a reach scale. What's going on within your community. So we encourage people to get their neighbors all together, and we'll just bring in a coastal expert, and we walk the beaches together and talk about what's going on, what we see, and how everybody can make improvements to benefit the shoreline. One thing we also did during the pandemic, when we couldn't really offer workshops in person, we took kind of some of the information from each of those little workshops, and we broke them into some bite-sized pieces, about 7 or 8 minute videos, and created a whole shoreline for friendly living video series, talking about coastal processes, impacts of shoreline armor. We have one that sort of just talks about kind of connecting the dots, so, that connectivity question, talking about the habitat and the ecosystem ecology. And now we're actually starting to work on a little mini series as well on vegetation, on native veg, and how to manage invasives, how to start if you have a blank slate of a smart development. And so we have 1 vegetation video out already, and we should have at least 3 or 4 more coming out within the next year or 2. Shoreline property owners through the Shore Friendly program can apply for free technical site visits, where we bring out a coastal professional, a geologist or an engineer, combination of the two, and everybody's individual properties are assessed for the erosion impacts, looking at vegetation, looking at drainage in particular, and as I mentioned earlier, also looking at setbacks. That's becoming one of those pieces of the puzzle that more and more we're going to need to start talking with folks about. If they're living too close to the edge of a bluff, if they're living too close to the edge of the shoreline, with climate change, how they manage risk is going to become more and more challenging. And ultimately, it may cost less and may allow people to sleep better if they pick up their houses and move them further back on their properties where they have the ability to do so. So that's definitely something that we are encouraging, and people can get consultation with these free site visits as well on that effort as well. For projects opportunities where we can remove shoreline bulkheads, we have grant funding as well to provide engineering, design, permitting assistance, and then we can also help apply for grants, and we can lead projects from start to finish for private property owners too, which is typically what we do on our projects, where we really manage, act as kind of a project manager for shoreline landowners, taking them from, just the initial site visits all the way through implementation of their actual construction project, where we handle the contracting and manage the entire project, from start to finish. I want to mention too, though, that our Shore Friendly program for years has, really been kind of working in concert with the Island County folks as well. But they actually Island County has its own Shore Friendly program. We offer, generally speaking, we offer a lot of these community outreach activities together for workshops, but site visits and any other kind of cost share opportunities, you can acquire those directly through the Island County program, which is managed through the county government. And they have a wonderful staff there and great consultants on their under contract there as well. But again, we still work really closely together on the program. So you can find their program as well, or any one of the Shore Friendly programs across the region, really just by looking in, Shore Friendly, and then putting in the county name that you're associated with. So this is just an example of kind of the different videos that we have. You can find these on our YouTube channel. So if you just go to YouTube and look up Northwest Straits Foundation, you can find the series of videos, and I can also provide the links to those later as well, so you can have access to those too. But right now, again, we've got 4 of them out. They average anywhere from I think 6 or 7 minutes, maybe up to 9 minutes or so. And just a couple of examples of some of the private properties that we've worked on over on Whidbey. 2 of the projects we've worked on have been community association parcels. So we've had opportunities for a little bit longer stretches of shoreline, where we've had, in this case, down in Clinton, about 350 feet of armor was removed And then the community itself really took the responsibility of managing all the vegetation. We helped them, pick out the right veg, and they've been watering it, and it's really been thriving. And the reason we didn't pull the shoreline further back is simply because there's a drain field, so we're limited by that. And they also wanted to maintain some lawn for the activities of their community there. But it's been a really successful program. And before, they really didn't have any decent access to get down to the shoreline because they'd have to climb over all this armor and rock and debris. We pretty much found everything there except for literally the kitchen sink, which is kind of the way that we see things around Puget Sound on these kind of legacy bulkheads where people are just adding more stuff to it over time. But now they have a beautiful opportunity to get to the beach. And even though they're inside of a spit and it's a little bit muddy typically, now they have actually a big kayak rack that the whole community keeps their boats down there, and they regularly are accessing the water through their own community beach now. And then we also had another project where we removed this. This is actually an old barge that somebody in the community way back in like the 70s took an old military barge and shoved it up against the shoreline of this big feeder bluff, and then put a huge concrete bulkhead all around it. And this is not uncommon. This is not the only one of its kind in the Puget Sound. And so it jutted out over 90 feet into the intertidal and about 135 feet or so along shore. And everywhere around this, there was active forage fish spawning, but nothing in the area where this bulkhead and structure sat, because it sat right in that area that's critical for forage fish within that mid to upper intertidal area. And so now the whole slope is revegetated, and there's lots of large woody debris accumulating, and the community has nice access down to the beach as well. Where they used to have an elevated platform, and they couldn't really get to the beach without falling themselves to get down there. So I know, not everybody here, on the program is probably a shoreline property owner, but I'm sure everybody knows somebody that is. So we just want to provide a little summary of, what you can do to reduce erosion, even though it's a natural process and we actually need it. But we do want to maybe allow for some minimal control of it. How do you protect your property? Also protecting habitat, which is obviously our key goal, is making sure that we're enhancing habitats. And the first thing we always tell people is that if they have a natural shoreline, that we want to maintain that natural shoreline as much as possible. It gives the greatest amount of protection and the greatest amount of the ability for the shorelines to provide their adaptations on its own as the way that it needs to. Where it's feasible, we definitely encourage people to consider removing armor and to let us help you do that. If somebody actually already has armor and it's not feasible to remove it, considering alternatives to hard armor, such as little more softer solutions using more natural features, logs, not a whole line of rock, and softening it up as much as possible, and also pushing it back as far as possible to above the mean high water mark, so that it's not impeding as much of the coastal processes, and it's not burying those nearshore habitats that are needed for all the invertebrates and birds, and obviously all of our fish species that swim right along the shoreline. And probably one of the easiest things that we encourage people to do is to plant or maintain a buffer of native vegetation, and to remove invasive plants such as ivy and blackberry as much as they can. And also making sure that people are managing drainage. The majority of our erosion in Puget Sound on these bluffs especially is really not occurring because of what's going on from the water. It's actually, a lot of it's just managing the inputs from the top and making sure that we don't have too much water flowing over the surfaces and onto the top of the bluff as well. And I also mentioned the relocation element as well. Can you consider moving your house out of that hazard zone a little bit further back on the property, so that one, you sleep better, and two, so that we can actually remove armor and or just maintain a natural habitat without worry about the house falling in eventually as the bluff erodes away. Same thing goes true for low-lying properties too, that are certainly going to be impacted by sea level rise. What can we do to get those houses out of that zone so that they're not constantly getting flooded and having water inundating them from both sides, above the bulkhead as well as from the seaward side. So I'm just going to talk a little briefly about stuff that it seems like is near and dear probably to your heart. And just kind of key in on some of the best, plants that you can use for reducing erosion and improving habitat through native vegetation. And this goes for, again, bluffs as well as those, no bank or beach properties too. But in particular on the bluff properties, what comes into play really is wanting to get some strong root strength to keep those soils all knitted together. And so I took this from Ben Alexander, who's from Sound Native Plants down in Olympia, and he's done several workshops for us and webinars for us over the years. And unfortunately, he's retiring. So I'm stealing his slides with his permission where I can. But just wanted to kind of give an example of, what it is that you would get from the roots of our large conifers that grow so naturally and so freely here, in the North Sound. The trees, especially, you get, these big soil blocks that anchors the soil together. It basically creates this network, of root systems, and almost as if you put an entire array of rebar up the slope. That's what you get from having large, healthy trees to knit it all together. And even with the shrubs, you get the same kind of thing. You sort of get this network of like a weaving together of the root systems, connecting the trees and the plants all together to almost create a single system. And also providing a lot of uptake of water from from rain as well as from the surface area as well. So I can't emphasize enough the need for large trees, putting in conifers versus just putting in some small shrubs to really stabilize our shorelines. So just go through some of the champion species, that we like to see along shorelines. First and foremost, and the easiest one for people to install, especially on low bank properties or no bank properties, is dune grass. We put this in as a bare root, and so it's really inexpensive. All you need to do is basically dig a little hole in the sand and lay the root in and cover it back up, and then wait for it to grow. And as long as it gets a little bit of water the first season, it's going to create a nice forest's worth of dune grass. It also knits sediments together. I'm sure as you've walked on your beaches and you've seen dune grass, flourishing, it builds up the beach because you'll have sediment, that actually builds in behind the dune grass. And so the elevation will actually increase over time of that area, which is really beneficial for abatement of wave energy. Also provides a whole lot of habitat for insects and butterflies and birds. Shorebirds love hanging out in the dune grass area as well. So it's a really kind of critical piece to our shorelines. And then just kind of talking as we're sort of getting a little bit taller, more of our some of these ground covers and low-lying shrubs that also do help. They're not going to really save the shorelines from eroding, but they're going to provide some stability. They're also going to provide a lot of color to attracting bees, and our pollinators. They are great for groundwater absorption, and really just kind of making sure that we don't have bare ground that's exposed and highly erosive that way. So this sort of some of the key players we like to see: seashore lupin. The flowers will be anything from yellow to purple. Beach pea is a great plant. It kind of just spreads all over the place and has these wonderful purple flowers. It's also a really early bloomer, so you get some of that nice spring color pretty early on. Silverweed is kind of more of a grass-like feel to it, but again, it sort of lies on the ground. It's really nice and shiny, and again, it has a bit of an evergreen feel to it. I think everybody's probably familiar with, to some level, with coastal strawberry. Again, it spreads really nicely, creates a nice ground cover. I love coastal gumweed. It's one of my favorite plants. It grows to about maybe 2 feet tall or so. Get another early bloomer, really great for bees, and does help with knitting some of the soils together too. And sea plantain, not as easy to come by if you want to actually plant it yourself, but it's a pretty common plant that you've probably seen around the shorelines. So again, plenty of others to choose from, but these are just sort of a few of our favorites that are easy to establish and provide a lot of variety of benefit. And then certainly as we start getting a little taller into our shrubs, beneficial uses of, any of these snowberry, ocean spray, and Nootka rose especially. These are all great because they can form big thickets. So in that sense, going back to that slide from Ben, this is really where the root systems kind of start connecting together and almost becoming one system. And with these trees, especially snowberry, Nootka rose, if you're trying to maintain a little bit of a view, they can be hedged a bit. You can cut them down, a little bit to allow for, allow them to not grow 20 feet tall, which they won't. But you can trim them as needed. Ocean spray is a little bit more tree-like. Same with beak hazelnut, but these are great shrubs with really strong root systems. Ocean spray in particular can tolerate full sun as well as salt spray. These are all salt-tolerant plants. They don't want their roots soaking wet, but they do, they do tolerate the actual salt spray kind of in that backshore region. Red osier dogwood, it tolerates wet winters and dry summers. So as our seasons are getting hotter in the summer, red osier dogwood is a great option. And beaked hazelnut as well. It's really hardy, has extensive roots. These are great shrubs to consider. And again, they also are, they attract a lot of birds, a lot of insects, which also, when we talk about insects and you talk about kind of salmonscaping, the insects that inhabit our upland plants are really what form the base of the food chain or the food web for our salmon or juvenile salmon as they're swimming along shore. And that's in particular for Chinook salmon. A good percentage of their diet as juveniles is actually insects coming from the uplands, not necessarily invertebrates in the marine waters themselves. So that's kind of an important reason to have that connectivity in addition to stabilizing the shorelines, for the people that are living on them. It provides a really important food source for not just salmon, but also all marine birds, shorebirds, and a lot of other invertebrates as well. And then we get into, kind of the ones that we're really, really interested in, providing a lot of that shoreline stability and just really contributing to the processes of our shorelines. Eventually over time, 100 years, from now, when one of these conifers falls over onto the beach, that provides more stabilization and more habitat and more structure to the shoreline itself. Shore pine is not necessarily particularly native to the inland areas, where the inland seas of Puget Sound. It's really more of, you see it out on the rocky shorelines of parts of the San Juans and actually out on the coast. But we're using shore pine more and more along our shorelines. One, because it doesn't grow quite as tall as our Doug firs and Sitka spruces. It does grow a little bushier, but it is also a little more highly adaptive to changing conditions. But the benefits of shore pine, Sitka spruce, and Doug firs in particular is that they all have a really strong taproot system almost, where they have these deep roots that go really far down into the soils. And so they can grab onto, what limited water is available to them. You'll notice that I don't have our cedars on here, simply because they're not doing very well these days on our shorelines. They're doing fine in the uplands where they're getting, where they have plenty of shade. But they don't have the big, strong root system. They have more of a lateral, shallow root system. And so they're struggling a bit more in our highly, we're getting into almost drought situations in the summers now. So we're really recommending Sitka spruce and Doug firs where it's possible. Obviously, you don't want to put a Doug fir right next to your house because they do shed a lot of branches as they grow up. Those lower branches do fall off. But these are great options for creating kind of a buffer and a secondary line of defense along the bluff edges, or the bluff crests rather. I can't say enough about putting in willows too. Willow stakes, again, it's similar to any of these other plants where you're kind of almost armoring the shoreline by adding willow stakes into the ground. They suck up so much water that they're kind of really champion species. And even if you put in 100 willow stakes and only 50 of them actually grow into trees, as an example, those other 50 willow stakes are really creating kind of a that rebar effect on the shoreline too, and helping to knit those soils together. And then if you wanted some more color and you wanted, a little bit of a different variety, vine maples are great trees as well. Really good, strong root system. You get that deciduous nature too, where, in the fall and the winter, you don't have the leaves on the trees, but they're still taking up water even when there's no leaves on the trees, despite that, they're not photosynthesizing necessarily, but they're still providing a lot of benefit for evapotranspiration. that's kind of, really what I wanted to talk about. There's a lot more we can always talk about, how to manage invasive species from a vegetation perspective, the best ways to put in plants and to, restore your shorelines. But those in and of themselves are, full presentations that I'd be more than happy to come back at some point and talk about. At that point, I will stop sharing and see if there's any questions.
Lisa, would you talk about the workshop? I know it's full, but if people get on the waiting list, would they be notified of the next one? And would there be one that was maybe closer to Camano?
We would probably have to work with the Island County shore friendly folks to, potentially schedule one in the future. When we look at the reason that we're doing it over in Smoky Point, so we tend to alternate between like Camano versus Snohomish when we're really putting a lot of focus on Port Susan Bay in particular. So we've done them on, in both locations, in Stanwood versus out on Camano as well. If you get on the waiting list and you put your name, I think you have to opt in for being part of our mailing list. And then if you're on our mailing list, then you get future notification, about any other events that we're holding. And so you would know, if the Island MRC, or not the MRC, if the Island County Shore Friendly Program were to do another workshop, we would make sure we would have that information too, and we'd help promote that. And we're also still always going to work in partnership with them on these outreach events. But again, so the workshop we've got a couple consultants from Herrera Environmental. One is a coastal geomorphologist. So she works on like the processes that are forming our shorelines and has done a lot of studies on our bluffs and the movement of sediment. And then we have another speaker as well as from Herrera that's really specializes in some climate change studies. So talking about climate change on the shoreline. And then for this workshop in particular, we're also bringing in somebody from Nickel Brothers house moving company to talk about what it takes to move a house. But his presentation will also cover a little bit about kind of like the carbon impacts of, tearing down a house, and starting over versus trying to move a house, rehabilitate that house. So it's kind of got a little bit of, climate change from a couple different perspectives. So that's kind of the gist of it. But yeah, we definitely encourage you if, we try and we market the workshops to shoreline landowners, but if you're not a shoreline landowner and you're still interested, put your name on the list. And if there's room, that's great, because we know that everybody communicates with their neighbors. And we hope that you would all, share the information as best as you can.
Right.
We do also, I should say too, that on our YouTube channel, we do have our past webinars as well on there too. We haven't done one that's really focusing as much on climate change and sea level rise, but we have done ones that focus on coastal processes, on shoreline armor, as well as the vegetation workshop with Ben Alexander from Sound Native Plants. So if somebody wants to sit down and, kind of run through some of those webinars, they're available on our YouTube channel as well.
Right.
The difference between what was and what is in like around Deception Pass or where you took out the barge, it's incredible when you can take that out. A lot of work though.
Yeah, it's a lot more work on the front end sometimes, it's like you do years and years of, coordination and, applying for grants and permitting and everything. And the projects are kind of done in like, a month. But
do you have a way to contact people that are like they move to the island or the waterfront areas and they think, oh, I got to have a bulkhead, and and they don't need a bulkhead? Do you have a way to tap into those people?
Yeah, definitely. The Shore Friendly Program, when we do our site visits, we're not just looking at people with armored shorelines. We do a lot, actually, probably the majority of our site visits now with the coastal professionals are actually for unarmored sites, trying to encourage people to think about more natural shorelines. So yeah, and that's, again, I'm working with a couple properties where they don't have armor now, but they don't really have any vegetation. So we're providing them with vegetation plans, and and they can get like up to $1,000 in a grant for vegetation. For we can, as long as they agree to put in some trees and not just shrubs and low-lying stuff. If they're going to put in a few conifers, we will help them to put in that the vegetation. We'll buy it for them, and it's all paid for by a grant. And they just have to put in the labor, basically. So there's different cost shares depending on the type of work that we're going to be doing. But for vegetation, if somebody's willing to reforest their properties, then we're willing to help them get there, as much as we can.
Well, when Ruth Milner, she retired, but she biologist, wildlife biologist.
Yep.
She said that Camano's actual endangered species was the trees, the tall trees.
Yeah.
And what they're doing for the banks, and also what they're doing like eagle nests and pileated woodpecker nests, and
yeah.
And so I'm glad you showed how important those trees on the slopes are.
Yeah, it's very, for so many reasons, and for me, if I kayak quite a bit, and I kind of think of like, what do you want to see from the water? When you think about what the Pacific Northwest should look like, it should look like a whole bunch of lawns and deforested shorelines. And, granted, I live in the middle of Bellingham in the city. I don't live on a shoreline. I don't live, in a wild area necessarily, but my view of what the area should look like should be more forested. And even if I were one of those property owners, you can create windowing effects, through those trees, but maintain privacy. Do you want somebody to see all the way through your house from their boat?
Right.
It's kind of what we see
and
now.
It all looks kind of sterile if you just have grass in the water.
Exactly.
The Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, exactly. That's the suburbs. Yeah. So reforestation is sort of, is really kind of one of my goals, when we can get there. But we do understand that we're working, in these environments where people have different goals for their own properties. So we try and find a balance.
Any questions out there in Zoom land? Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for telling us this information. I think it's just critical, especially for new people that move to shore areas, and what they can do rather than what they think they should do.
Yeah, exactly. And if by some chance, if you find, you meet people that are new and somebody doesn't remember that the Island County program has their own effort, you just look up Shore Friendly and it shows us covering 7 counties. People can certainly reach out to me and I can get them in contact, with that program too. So.
Great. That's good to hear that Island County has that. We don't get information like that like we used to when I first moved to the island. It's
There's been some turnover.
Yeah. Okay.
Again, thank you so much. I really appreciate you inviting me to speak. It seems like you guys are, well suited to working on some great issues, and I applaud your efforts to help to rewild the island.
And its feeling is mutual. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Have a good night.
Thanks everyone for coming. Come back in March for owls.
Take care.